designed to free you from the four walls of today for a half hour of high adventure.
So we're here today with Dr. Richard Stopford, and the topic is, what is philosophy? I'm hoping for a really interesting conversation. So this is a bit of a weird way to start the podcast, but I was in the shower this morning, and as I often do, reading the back of my shampoo bottle, and it said on it, professional, affordable, exceptional, this is our philosophy.
Right.
Do you think that's a misuse of the term, in your opinion?
No. That's a very good question, actually. A good way to start off. By the way, thanks for having me.
No problem.
I mean, one thing that I would say is because I have quite a pragmatist approach to semantics. As long as something's a good use, it is indeed a use of the term, then it counts as an appropriate way to
People will
use
understand what
the
word means. Yeah.
And that's certainly intelligible. It's certainly a kind of common use of the term. I mean, obviously, the thing with obviously philosophy can be, it can be a noun, it can be to do philosophy, there's very different ways that we can kind of intake the word, and that's just one way. Obviously, that's kind of being co-opted in a kind of a sloganeering kind of marketing kind of way. But that's the idea, of somebody having an ethos, having a mission in a company term, having a mission statement or something like that. And presumably you can unpack that to sets of principles, and maybe you could say that is something like a systematic form of philosophy, which is going to be more similar to what you might think of as like a professionally produced system of philosophy. But
does that apply as well when people say, I've got a philosophy when it comes to diet, or this is my life philosophy? It's still kind of...
okay, so, I mean, personally, I suppose I should say that most of what I'm going to say is how I see philosophy and how I see things. And I certainly wouldn't want to say that either that anything that I would say about this is definitive or speaks for other philosophers or indeed other people when they're thinking about what philosophy is. I mean, certainly I think that, anybody can be a philosopher, and I think people are, I think it's been said, I think Peirce said this, that people are natural philosophers. And what does that mean? Well, it means that they're reflective beings. They reflect on their own practices broadly construed. So, I mean, obviously there's that doesn't count all thinking. There's thinking that's just, the thinking that's involved in cooking, doing an activity, let's say. But we reflect on our thinking, we reflect on our practices, and as far as we do that, we're doing something like a philosophy broadly construed, I think. And I think that's important, because one of the things that really interests me then is, we can ask the question from an ahistorical point of view, with the kind of thought that we can nail an ahistorical answer, or an answer that's not going to be indexed in some way to socio-cultural historical phenomena. Yeah. I certainly would imagine that some people who call themselves philosophers would think that's the right form of the question, and that's the sort of answer that we should expect. Personally, I don't think that. And I think that what makes me say that, linking back to what I was just talking about, is I think that it's... I think the fact that people are philosophers in some broad way is quite important culturally at the moment, because there's a wrangle over knowledge-making practices. There's a wrangle over kind of like intellectual capital.
What do you mean by knowledge-making practices?
Okay, so obviously one of the big kind of public intellectual discussions that's going on at the moment is kind of science versus, in terms of your kind of Hawking, Dawkins, kind of Neil deGrasse Tyson, people such as these. Yeah. And they have a view about science, and they have a view about science vis-a-vis knowledge. And
do you think that philosophy should always be a secular discipline? Do you think that it's necessarily non-religious?
Well, look, this is an important point in terms of, again, how we see philosophy. I think philosophy as a professionalized. So there's philosophy in the way that we were just talking about it, which is, this kind of like very egalitarian activity, and just in terms of people's thinking practices. And then there's something like philosophy as a professionalized practice, or a practice that involves particular kinds of expertise.
These are two distinct things.
Well, they certainly can come together, but they don't. For me, they don't co-vary, and they're not the same thing. They're not the same thing. So people that are philosophers in the first sense needn't be philosophers in the second sense. But insofar as they're not philosophers in the second sense, it doesn't follow they're not philosophers at all.
I see. Got it.
But the thing is that, so the relationship between philosophy and religion is going to be, and in there, when I'm talking about philosophy in kind of some sort of professionalized sense, I mean, this is going to be a socio-historical and cultural issue for me to some degree. I don't think that that's something that I can say outside of history and say what philosophy ought to be ahistorically. It's I'm not an historian of philosophy, and I'm not a historian more generally. And in actual fact, I should say this. I was thinking about this as I was just kind of putting some thoughts in my head together about this stuff that I wanted to say. I think that trying to answer this question, what is philosophy? I think it would be hubristic of philosophers to think that they are the only
What does that
people.
mean?
So what I mean is that it would be a kind of intellectual arrogance.
Okay.
And to think that that's a question just for philosophers, and maybe more particular. I mean, they probably don't think that. They probably think that it's of general interest. But what I mean is that it's only really philosophers that should be allowed and are able to have some sort of input.
Do you think that answer
discussion
might be? I've certainly found that sort of response frustrating for me, because I'm doing Freshers Week preparation stuff at the moment. Lots of people go around and say, "What subject are you doing?"
Yeah.
And if someone says computer science, and they say, "Oh, what's computer science?" It's very easy to put some sort of answer together. But when you're going around and you've only just started doing philosophy and someone asks what it is, it can be quite difficult then to say, "Oh, well, it's difficult to answer that question." And then obviously people are like, "Oh, well, that's a very philosophical response."
Yeah.
And I think that people have this idea that philosophy has this sense of mysticism about it, and I don't know. I think perhaps not having a good answer to the question, what is philosophy, can be quite difficult for people studying it.
Yeah, I remember I was teaching Knowledge and Reality, which is one of our first year courses. We were introducing kind of issues of epistemology. One of the students got kind of annoyed, and they were just like, why do we as philosophers just have to spend so much time worrying about whether we're allowed to do when worrying about what we're doing and worrying whether we should be doing it. But unfortunately, I think that that's a double-edged sword, because I think that on the one hand you go, so philosophy is its own question. And that's kind of continually destabilizing. But the thing is that what I wanted to say is that I two things. One, you can just, as a very quick point, I think that means that philosophy isn't going away, because the only thing that could even try and kill philosophy is philosophy. So, I mean, were someone to say, for example, "Oh, philosophy's dead," I'm like, go on then.
Yeah, show me how.
Yeah, and I'd be very curious to see you try and pull that off without something that isn't going to be reasonably called philosophy. It sounds like performative contradiction.
Yeah.
But I think that why shouldn't philosophy... I mean, yes, maybe it's not very satisfying in a world... I don't know. Maybe it's not very satisfying if you think that answers should be nicely prepared. But I think that... I think that it's good to see that it's a shifting target in some sense. But that doesn't mean it's not unanswerable. It doesn't mean also that you can't have multiple answers, or that the answers aren't going to change. And it's just, suck it up. It's a complex endeavour.
Do you personally have a sort of stock response if you go to a pub and you meet someone and they ask you the question?
No. No, I much prefer to just rather than say. I'd probably be more inclined to say, well, what do you when you hear somebody say, what do you think when? Let's start with that. What do you think when I say I do philosophy? And then we'd just start from there. We'd just have a chat.
Yeah.
Hang on. Where were we? So much kind of already on the table. I mean, so going back to the secular point, I think what I want to say is that I don't think that you can say historically what it ought or ought not to be. Rather that particular forms of philosophy and how philosophy self-understands and the sort of domain of inquiry that it thinks that are appropriate to itself as a discipline that are maybe even, if not completely distinctive, that philosophers have some kind of distinctive take on, and the methods that are going to be employed, which are in some sense that the domain and the methods going to be in some way constitutive for philosophy. I just think that that's going to be a function of social and historical practices. Now, I don't also think it doesn't also follow from that philosophy is just up in the air and it's just kind of. It's all like some relativist morass, and that we're not. There's nothing like that couldn't conceivably be called progress within philosophy. I don't think that follows from that.
Would you agree with the statement that whilst there can't be right answers, there can be wrong answers in philosophy?
Well, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So even alongside that very kind of historicist I've been pushing this kind of historicist kind of. Agenda in certain respects, and also thinking that, as I said, I think that sociologists and historians, for example, maybe amongst others, would have very interesting things to say about what philosophy is. It's not just us.
Do you think its meaning has changed a lot through the course of history?
Well, it has, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, in order to see that, I mean, one of the courses that we teach, reading philosophy, my understanding, at least, I haven't actually taught on that course, but my understanding of it is that it's aimed at trying to it's kind of starting with a meta-philosophical approach, which is just to say reflecting a second-order reflection on some particular practice being the writing and reading of philosophy. And it's really interesting if you look at one of the things they're doing is looking at different texts over different periods of time. And philosophy has changed radically. Now, the reasons for those changes are extremely complex, from increases, changes in, or you might say, let's put it slightly more neutrally, developments in philosophical practice. So a classic one is going to be logic. So the developments, there's clear developments in our logical practices from Aristotelian style logic through to our kind of contemporary kind of post-Fregean logic, and that's going to change the way that philosophy looks insofar as you're employing logic, and that's an explicit part of a paper. Let's say that's going to change how it looks. If you look at the way that Kant writes, to the way that Wittgenstein's Tractatus looks, to the way that a contemporary analytic paper or a contemporary kind of continental paper, that's another issue.
Do you think it's easier to track the changes within analytic philosophy compared to continental philosophy?
Technically speaking, analytic philosophy is very young.
It might be worth actually just describe the change.
Yeah, okay, so, again, a complex kind of phenomenon within philosophy. But speaking quite broadly for those people that aren't aware of this, one way that you can kind of this is going to be very broad brushstroke history of philosophy, but one way that you can kind of think about developments in philosophy is kind of a trajectory in Enlightenment philosophy. So we have certain key players people might be aware of, than the empiricists and the rationalists. And in the later Enlightenment period, just before we move into a kind of romantic stage, you got this big player, kind of Kant. Kant is a big player, and I don't know why I'm using these players. Anyway,
I quite like it.
Yeah. On the team, Kant's captain at this point.
It's a Monty Python sketch.
Yeah, we'll cut that bit out. Anyway, So anyway, yes, it is a Monty. It's Benny Hill, is what it is. Anyway, so and Kant kind of inaugurated, one of the things that Kant inaugurates is a really explicit program of self-critique about what the scope and possibilities for philosophy are, and also a certain, this is kind of controversial in terms of Kant scholarship, but let's just say some kind of skepticism towards some kind of metaphysics, where, again, if people don't know what that means, so metaphysics, just very broadly construed, is inquiry into the nature of reality. And it's certainly been an historical point that philosophers have thought from their armchair, a priori, i.e. by pure thought alone, they can inquire into the nature of reality and kind of come back with truths about the nature of reality. And Kant, in a very complex way, was kind of skeptical about that as an activity. Now, the thing is that, again, for slightly complex reasons about Kant, you can kind of start to get two paths that emerge from Kant. You can kind of go, so one way that you can kind of take Kant is a focus on subjectivity and the nature of subjectivity. And that the nature of subjectivity is such that it comes with certain kinds of constraints. And that moreover, that those constraints, that we're definitely kind of colouring the world in a particular kind of way, that the world comes to us in a mediated fashion. And really what we should be doing is looking at, therefore, if we want to kind of know things, we need to kind of, at the very least, be aware of these mediations of how we kind of filter and in some senses reconstruct the world for us. And so our knowledge-making practices are, in a certain sense, a function of our kind of cognitive nature. So you get this kind of quite subjective kind of trajectory. Another trajectory is to say, well, look, let's batten down the hatches. Let's see what we can kind of let's kind of focus philosophy in particular ways. Let's look at the way in which we judge. Let's look at our knowledge-making practices. How do we construct judgments? How do we use concepts? How do we how do we think logically and rationalize? And those are kind of two trajectories. And then again, jumping forward. Now, in actual fact, people like Russell and Moore, they came out of this German idealist tradition that Kant was a part of, but they would come to reject it. So you say, okay, so analytic philosophy is a rejection of this kind of German idealism. That's an interesting question, actually, because some philosophers actually think, well, yes, there's a decisive break in some sense, particularly with with British idealism, which was quite Hegelian. But still, there was there is a kind of burgeoning focus on judgment, on language that's kind of present in Kant, and that this kind of sets an analytic agenda. So what the analytic philosophers were thinking of doing is there was an increasing as what came to be known as analytic philosophy developed, there was an increasing interest in language and increasing distrust of metaphysics, an increasing attachment to scientific practice, scientific methodology. And philosophy became quite quietistic, arguably, in that period. It became increasingly suspicious of its old questions and its old the scope and possibility of its inquiries and what sort of answers it can come back with. What we should really be doing is analysing concepts, dispelling self-generated philosophical confusions, and paving the way for proper, rigorous scientific analysis of the nature of the world. This is one trajectory in capital A analytic philosophy.
Okay.
Oh, that's one trajectory in philosophy. The other one is to go, arguably, then you keep up with this subjective kind of way of thinking about things. And you go towards phenomenological schools, and this is kind of pushing towards a kind of so-called continental school, which is, well, Descartes and Kant in quite singular ways were onto something when they were thinking knowledge starts from the self, and we have some privileged knowledge about the self. Let's kind of really explore that. And then you've got a really complex stylistic difference.
Could you identify what's continental and what's analytic by the writing style, do you think?
Yeah, well, this is really controversial stuff. And you ask most people that do philosophy, they might and ah to some extent about what I'm saying, which is fair enough. Personally, I think that there is a stylistic difference, but it's certainly not what it used to be. I mean, for a start, like stylistic, it's also it's a construction that analytic philosophy is clear and rigorous. There are great classics of analytic philosophy that are very, very difficult, I think. Like Russell's on denoting. I think that's a hard piece of philosophy to read. And it certainly doesn't look like something you're going to get in a contemporary analytic journal. And that kind of gets fudged. There's a kind of a self-presentation from, and I'm not partisan here because I do both, or at least I'm involved in both continental and analytic philosophy.
If you were teaching aesthetics, for example, would you have to teach it using a continental method, or could you teaching it with an analytic one?
There's aside from preferences of what I would want to do there. No, I mean there's plenty of. Obviously, aesthetics is a huge part of continental philosophy because following that trajectory from phenomenology, and then you've got the critical theory school going on at the same time as the phenomenological school of Husserl and Heidegger was developing, and then you've also got the kind of take up of Saussurean semantics. You've got the take up of psychoanalysis. So you've got structuralisms, then leading into post-structuralism, and then by the time you get to the kind of contemporary landscape. One way that you can understand an end game, as it were, of a certain kind of continental philosophy is the aestheticization of philosophy, that really what we've got is appearances and the qualities of appearances in some sense or other. On the one hand, that's a huge part of aesthetics. But then there's there's a kind of aesthetics which sounds very analytic, like, oh, can we give the necessary and sufficient conditions for something counting as an artwork? And there are different approaches, and they look different.
So it's not a clear divide in any way.
No, and this is the other thing. So analytic philosophy these days, if it's anything, is probably more stylistic, because certainly the kind of what you might say the traditional programs of certainly early Wittgenstein and the logical positivists, they don't. That kind of conceptual analysis, well, certainly still goes on in some sense or other. There are people that are stylistically analytic who would definitely want to would be very skeptical of anything like. So, for example, just somebody that I know about, John Heil, he's a contemporary metaphysician, and one of the things that he grumbles about is what he calls picture theory of philosophy and of language, where basically we're kind of representing the world with our in sentences or judgments, whatever you want to say, our meaning-bearing entities are. And so you could kind of say, well, we can read off states of affairs from how we represent the world, and what we should really be concerned with then is the concepts that are involved in those representations. He's kind of that could be a quite analytic way of approaching things, and he's certainly analytic stylistically, but he's reticent about that as a program. And then you've got people such as myself that are somewhat stylistically analytic but work on continental philosophy, and there are certainly certainly Judith Butler, who's picked out as she's an extremely important philosopher. But she engages with Kripke. Kripke's an important part, a very significant part of the analytic tradition. So I'm not sure. And certainly, even with the stylistic differences, there's certainly something to be rigorous in continental philosophy, and there's something to be rigorous in analytic philosophy. But also, again, from a sociological point of view, or something like a sociological point of view, rigor is not a transparent notion. It's not something that kind of just fell out of the sky, and is it itself what counts as rigor. What counts as a form of a reason? What counts as a form of an argument? These are socio-historical phenomena as well.
To someone who has never studied philosophy before, how would you best describe what a philosophical question is as opposed to any other question you ask?
Well, I think this is one of the things about philosophers is that you stick them in an empty room and you'll have two arguments. One of the things that I like about philosophy is that I can be philosophical. One of the things for me is philosophy is an existential enterprise. And what I mean by that is not necessarily existentialist in kind of that being a school of philosophy that takes what I'm about to say very seriously, has very particular kinds of answers about that. But I think that philosophy is, going back to what we were saying right at the start, we're in the world, and the world and ourselves is a complex, dynamic, fascinating, compelling, and confusing place. And so everyone is more or less interested in the fact that things are dynamic, confusing, compelling.
Very difficult not to be.
Now the question is, if you're kind of become a philosopher, the likelihood is that you're very interested. This is a natural disposition. And so the existential point is to say that for me, philosophy is, I have a very romantic, old-fashioned view in one sense. It's meaning of life stuff, but not where that meaning of life question or answer is going to be discontinuous with our lived experience, but rather it's embroiled within it and a function of it. And so just speaking for myself, my own philosophical practice is really a very privileged opportunity to engage with those questions in an organised fashion where I have space to be able to do that in an institutional setting.
And how do you know when you've solved a problem in philosophy? If you pose a question, lots of people have lots of different answers.
So there's one way that philosophers will evaluate a theory is whether it's kind of like internally coherent, so we'll be looking for are there inconsistencies in it, or is it consistent with things that we don't want it, some model we don't want it to be consistent with. There'll be how will we tend to evaluate, although this is controversial as well, our philosophical answers against common sense. So
people assume that they should align with common sense to a great degree.
As I say, this is actually a significant issue in philosophy. But certainly, it's one way that people might be inclined to evaluate. If you inquire into some particular phenomenon, and if it comes out that it's just radically at odds with common sense, it might suggest that there's something wrong with the answer about it.
That's weird though, because in physics, for example, and quantum mechanics, almost everything is completely at odds with common sense, and yet we still have to accept it. Yeah. So why is philosophy different in that regard?
One of the part of where this wrangle emerges about common sense is over metaphysics and the relationship of metaphysics to science. And depending on how you jump about that, you're going to probably have different roles or different significance for common sense. So it's not that it's the case that that it's significantly different. And in actual fact, some philosophers would, myself included actually, I have modest realist kind of inclinations. So I think that there's no reason to think that the way that the fundamental phenomena, how that turns out to be, is radically at odds with what we expect it to be. And likewise, it might turn out that what things could count as an object turn out to be radically different to how we might commonsensically think of an object, let's say. And that's the latter question certainly could converge with science, just as an aside, but it's also got a distinctly philosophical feel to it, that question. What are objects? And that's something that interests me because, for example, so I have a view of objects which is maybe surprising from a commonsensical point of view. So for a start, I think that objects, as said in the metaphysical jargon, I think that they co-locate, so that you can have more than one object in the same spatio-temporal location. Now, I would suspect that the commonsensical view about objects is that they're spatio-temporally exclusive. But then you're in the game. You're thinking, right, okay, so why is that? Why do you think that they're spatio-temporally exclusive? Well, you might think that that's because all objects are concreter, and insofar as something's a concrete object, well, you might understand concrete objects in terms of spatio-temporal exclusivity. So it's going to fall out of that definition of a concrete object.
I suppose by questioning why your intuitions are what they are, you can get a lot of answers that way.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm quite happily to modally differentiate objects. So this is getting slightly more technical. So to give you an example, like a statue and a lump, and this is kind of classic in metaphysics. You say, well, like clearly we've got one putative object in front of us, the statue, or the thing that the bronze statue. Now you might think that the statue and the thing that it's composed of are identical. After all, there's just one thing in front of us. I mean, and this kind of plays to the exclusivity thought. We've got material objects.
The statue and the statue
and the lump are just the same thing.
Okay.
So you might think, right, okay, so they're identical. But one way of thinking about identity is like, I mean, philosophers tend to take identity very seriously. Well, there's an analytic way and there's arguably continental ways of thinking about identity, going back to Hegel in the latter. But anyway, analytic philosophy is going to say, look, if A and B, object A and object B turn out to be identical, then anything that's true of A better be true of B. Or another way of thinking about it is every property of A better be a property of B. But the thing is that with the statue and the lump, well, it seems as though they do pull apart. So it's true of the lump that we can melt it down. And let's not worry about the scientific niceties here. Maybe it loses some, parts through the heating process. But let's say that we can do this, and it just turns into a different shape. Well, we've clearly lost the statue there. So it's true of the lump that it can change shape, but it's not true of the statue that it can change shape. And conversely, let's say that we can hollow out the statue. But as long as we maintain the outside shape, let's say we're happy to say that that's still the same statue, but we've certainly lost the lump. The lump was a particular mass, it was a particular volume, and now it's not that. So, well, if we think that identity is going to be strict and that the truths and the properties better co-vary, and they better be the same rather, then that looks as though they're different things. Well, some people would say, well, that's just too weird. Like, now what? So we've got, like, are they ghost objects? Are we double counting these objects? We've got one material thing. We know this much. Or now do we have to have abstract objects? And, like, so we've got
start inventing new things.
Yeah. So you might think, well, we've got to dissolve this. We've got to get around this. Or you bite the bullet in some way, and you say, actually, it turns out that objects are propertied entities, and if we think about properties in a particular kind of way, maybe they do come apart. And then there's a surprising fact about objects. Now, that's just a very quick kind of example. And I don't want. I have a view about that, but that's a way that.
Do you think, going back to just philosophy in more general, a lot of people's criticisms of philosophy are that you can't measure any sort of progression in the way that you can in the sciences. Would you agree with that? Would you say that there isn't any sort of philosophical progress?
I think that's false on two counts. One, it's false. That the thought that we just simply haven't. It's certainly okay, so I'm saying false in this very kind of like belligerent way.
So it seems like you only need one if that's the case.
Well, there's one where it's kind of brute, where you, however you think of like progression. I want to say something like however you think of progression. It's just not the case that we haven't improved our methods or gotten somewhere. And for example. Logic, again, just because it's easy. We've certainly improved, in some sense or other, our logical methodology. And that the kind of gains made by philosophers have had a significant and positive impact on other disciplines there. Computer science is an obvious example. So that's one thing, but the other, that's also in some sense slightly less interesting. The more interesting one is the second thing, to say, well, look, what are you expecting philosophy to do? And that is, first of all, it's a philosophical question about what you expect philosophy to do and the sorts of answers it's supposed to be delivering. And but I think that there's a few things here. First of all, let's even assume that philosophy can engage with ahistorical phenomena. Let's say that they really are abstracter, like the numbers or something. Let's say that they're abstracter and that numbers are abstracter. And then we do presumably they're not changing then. And we can do some metaphysical inquiry about those. Now, just because the subject matter doesn't change, it doesn't follow that either the kind of the inquiry or the methods of inquiry won't change. And just because the methods of inquiry doesn't change, or that we can't know for certain that we've kind of nailed the answer, that we haven't made progress, that doesn't follow. It might be the case, but it doesn't follow. But more to the point, I think that a lot of what philosophy inquires into is dynamic in a way that, and changing in a way that it's inappropriate to ask of it that in order for us to consider it to have progressed, that it should be able to produce ahistorical answers that are not going to change in the future, and that its methods are not going to change in the future.
Sort of paradigm breaking.
Yeah, things. The phenomena that we're engaged with, a vast swathe of it is dynamic and is changing. We ought to be responsive as philosophers to the changing nature of our subject matter. And what might be a good way of approaching something at some point might change in the future. Plus as well, then there's just an epistemological question of, even if that's not true, even if you think that you don't like that, it should be incumbent upon the philosopher to be able to prove, as I say, as a point of epistemology, that we're able to prove that we're right in whatever we think.
That's not the right way to measure progress.
That's not how I think about justification from an epistemological point of view. It's not how I think about knowledge-making practices. And it's something that we don't hold scientists to either.
No. There's not an easy way to say how technology has progressed in a better or worse way.
And by the same token, I don't want to throw baby out with the bathwater there and then just say, well, it's just a morass. There's no progress. I just think that the issue is just much more complex than that. And the idea that we just, philosophy's still going. Well, yes, we're still going. It's a human activity.
Do you think there could be could you give an example of something, an event in philosophy, in the study of philosophy in the future, which could happen where someone could say that's a problem solved with philosophy? Or could you give an example of a problem that has been solved in philosophy?
Well, in a certain sense, again, I'm going to, just for ease, talk in rather broad brushstrokes here. But a classic one is logical positivism, which, as I mentioned it earlier, so this is kind of a view about the meaningfulness. Well, some of what's involved in this is a view about the meaningfulness of different kinds of sentences which involve different kinds of vocabularies. And one of the principal claims is that in order for a sentence to be meaningful, it needs to be empirically respectable. We'd need to know about how we'd go about proving that or demonstrating that rather from an empirical point of view. And part of what the logical positivists were trying to do was trying to align philosophy with scientific practice in a particular kind of way. And I mean, this is slightly unfair on the logical positivists, but again, just for ease, one of the problems that emerged from that as a research program, put it that way, was that it became very, very difficult to articulate this as a methodological practice in a way which wouldn't result in it itself being meaningless, because you couldn't demonstrate the principle that all sentences, in order for them to be meaningful, must be we must know how to empirically demonstrate that it's the case. That's not something that we can do with that principle. Now, it's much more complex. In actual fact, there are logical problems, and there's also some very weird kind of results that actually come out of that, and how we construe the kind of this ultimately kind of scientific empiricist sentences that this theory was supposed to kind of validate. It came out with some very weird results. So certainly that as a traditional program is one that emerged not willfully by philosophers, like that was not unreasonably seen as, oh, this is an advance, and it's an advance that was in step with the times. But it proved to be problematic, and this was, the people that were involved in it as well were extremely smart people, and they saw a lot of the problems themselves with their own program.
So it's a complete misconception to think that philosophical problems are by their nature unanswerable.
Yeah. Again, but I just want to know more about what people expect when they expect an answer. I mean, this is really interesting. I think about, again, more sociologically, about something like a sociological point here, about what sort of form we expect to consume our knowledge in at a social level. Like, how do we, in terms of public discourse, how do we give and take reasons? What counts as both a good reason, but as a reason that's exchangeable in a kind of public forum? And I think that philosophy is in a really tricky position here, because for a number of reasons. One, everyone, as we've already established, is in some sense or other a philosopher. So for any kind of philosophical issue that makes it into the public domain, or anything that's already in the public domain which has some sort of philosophical dimension to it, or way that we can approach it, such as science, for example, people might go, well, like I can think. I think about things, and what gives you the right as a philosopher to come and kind of wade in over the top of everyone else? The other thing is that, as has been made a lot of, the philosophers, and there's certainly some, it's fair to level this criticism about philosophy. that we have this quite technical way of approaching things, and then there's a question about how necessary that technicality is, and how much use it does. And then just from the point of view of communication, like let's even assume that like it is necessary. Well, how do we communicate?
It does seem necessary, because I initially thought that one of the problems with philosophy is that we have so many isms and all this technical language, and perhaps doing this podcast, I thought that we could kind of bring it back to basics. But as soon as you get into any topic, you have to use technical vocabulary, otherwise you don't really get anywhere.
Absolutely. What I want to say is that it is a technical, there is something that is a philosophical expertise, and it doesn't follow from that the philosophers, those people who are capital P philosophers, are the best at this, or are right in virtue of doing philosophy. But nevertheless, what we're trying to understand is complex enough that it requires technical expertise. Yeah. And all philosophers are trying to do, amongst many other disciplines, is trying to develop methods by which we can engage with this very complex phenomena that is the world and reality and ourselves, etc., in a way that's appropriate to that complexity. But the thing is that the problem then is that our engagement in a public forum, I mean, one thing that's interesting to note is that philosophers have not been anywhere near as successful as scientists, for example, for not only conveying what they're doing, but also establishing their kind of cultural capital as authorities about knowledge. Now, this is a hugely complex and controversial.
Is this like Brian Cox and Neil deGrasse Tyson?
Yeah, absolutely. And
is there a philosophical equivalent, do you think?
No, I mean, there are. Well, I mean, this is interesting. Again, sociologically, in England, certainly not so much. We probably got Alan de Botton, like Julian Baggini. But yeah, there aren't many.
Most people wouldn't have heard of their names.
If you go to France, certainly the idea of the public intellectual who is more likely to be, if not a philosopher, certainly from the humanities and certainly going to be versed in philosophy. That's a more common kind of, and that's something a culturally interesting thing. But one of the things, but why is it? Why is it that science has established itself? Well, the obvious quick answer is to say, well, because science has overtaken philosophy as our principal knowledge-making activity, both in terms of its success, and this goes back to what the idea of progress, etc.
Would you agree with that science has overtaken philosophy?
No, it's. I think that science has proven itself to be one of our, in a certain sense, it has proven to be our most successful epistemic activity. And this is one of the reasons why I think it's established its social capital, is because it can demonstrate that success. Does science work? Well, we're the products of science are sitting all around us, and it's clearly the case that philosophy, for example, is just another discipline. We can't do that. But one of the interesting things is that, and I certainly don't want to deny that. I'm certainly not skeptic. No. I'm not scientistic. I don't want to reduce all questions. So my kind of no answer there was just, I don't think that all questions could be answered by science. No, I don't even think that's intelligible. And I think that would be inappropriate demand to make of scientific practice. And I'm talking about science here, but science is a really complex phenomenon in its own right. Science is, for me, is a complex set of normative practices which are, whether that they amount to an homogenous kind of discipline, it is again a complex issue in its own right. I'm not equipped to answer that. But the thing is that for philosophy, one of the things that's interesting about science, or the kind of reception of science, I think, and this is just off the top of my head, I don't know, I don't research on this, but it's the fact that because it clearly works in some sense, it's clearly successful in some sense, and rightly so to be understood in that way. And when I read the popular science books, I'm very interested, and I think it's incredible and amazing what we're being told. Like I read The Elegant Universe, it totally blew my mind. I thought it was an incredible book. But I'm not a scientist. I can't evaluate that. I can't. That what the scientists have done an extremely good job. I mean this wholeheartedly of presenting their findings, as it were, to us in a digestible form. But I don't think as a consumer of that I'm in a position to evaluate it. I still feel that the expertise lies with, and rightly so, it lies with, they are experts in this area. I am not. And the structure of authority there is very much kind of like towards them. It doesn't also follow from that fact, though, that philosophers and indeed other people in the humanities have nothing to say about the sciences. And that what science is and what its goals are just, again, it would be hubristic of the scientist to think that what science is and its self-evaluation is just a matter for itself.
Do you think a philosopher would have more authority than a scientist in terms of metaphysics?
That's a really that's a can of worms. I mean, I just want to finish this one point,
okay,
and maybe we'll come back to that. But what I want to say is that I'm really interested in this kind of idea of authority, and over a philosophical issue, because people can genuinely claim to be philosophers in some sense, they are philosophers in some sense or other, and whilst the methods of expertise and the subject matter is not esoteric necessarily, like in the way. So what do you think you know about black holes? Well, I, nothing that a scientist, I've got nothing to say about that, but people have something to say about ethics, and rightly so. They're involved in that. That's important to them. They will have thoughts about ethics. And so it's so in terms of,
I guess everyone has first-hand experience with ethics, but not with black holes.
And the deference that people would have towards philosophers about that is nowhere near the same, and rightly so. But the thing is, it doesn't follow from that fact that the philosophers haven't developed like quite complex and quite useful and quite incisive modes of analysis. The problem is that we can't just report that back as in like a digestible form that people are just going to go, oh right, yeah, okay, they've sorted it out.
Yeah,
I just hear what they've got to say about it. No, and rightly so, because people do own ethics. They do have an involvement in that. So we have a very different in terms of like trying to kind of it's going back to your earlier point about like what people make of what we do and how we kind of establish our our social and cultural and intellectual capital. I think that philosophers are in a very tricky situation from that point of view. Plus as well, in terms of how we consume information and we consume theories, I think that there's no easy way to package it up. If you want to know about what the philosopher thinks about ethics, they're going to do some ethics. And that's going to be, right, you best sit down because I'm going to be here for an hour or so. As I kind of unpack. Yes, you might think that it's straightforward in this kind of way, but...
And you have to understand the argument, whereas in science you can just see the result.
And accept it, because unless you're a scientist, you're not really in a position to kind of evaluate it. No, I mean, you obviously got very informed lay people, but I'm not one of them. So I just think that, I mean, this is a difficulty that I think that philosophy has. It has socially in establishing itself, and also when you, and just on a parochial level, when you're involved in conversations with people, because it's a very diffuse activity, it's a very complex activity, and it's both very familiar to people and it's very esoteric at the same time. And trying to kind of establish that and explain how that works is very, very difficult.
Absolutely. Did you want to go back to that point on metaphysics?
Yeah, well, okay. So all I want to say is that I mean, that's philosophers themselves have very, very different kind of views about that. Some philosophers are going to say, look, they're going to be very scientific about it, regardless of like, you know, your kind of cultural level questions. They're just going to say, look, when it comes to whatever fundamental reality consists in, the only game in town is science. And if you want to do metaphysics, fine. But it's basically just the metaphysics for science. So it's classic kind of handmaiden of science kind of stuff. Yeah. And if you go down that route, then it just stands to reason that the philosopher, at the very least, better understand the science. And it could also be that, well, because there's no reason that the scientists can't be philosophers, and they are. Like, they are philosophers in the small p sense, just like as everyone else is. And they may also be the best philosophers and to talk about. But the thing is that they will need to, I think that there is something that they will need to be philosophers as well as scientists if they want to talk about certain aspects of scientific practice.
I see.
Yeah. But then there's other philosophers that want to say, no, absolutely not. No, there's still something that's a priori metaphysics, that it's not beholden to science. Certainly, if science and metaphysics comes apart, then there's going to be a really interesting burden of proof as to like who owes who an explanation as to why that's come apart. But it's just, jury's out, and this is a really this is a hot topic in contemporary metaphysics about how to do it from a metaphysical point of view.
Nice.
There you go. That's a good bit of jargon. The thing is that, like, you know, that goes back to Kant in some way as well. Like, can we do metaphysics? And if we can do metaphysics, what does that metaphysics look like? And that's really.
Do you think it's best in all of these areas of philosophy? Would it be best, do you think, to set out the structure and work out what's the best way to conduct it beforehand, or is that something that's only discovered through doing it?
Well, I'm inclined to say the latter, and that's something also about the way that I see kind of what I'm most interested in about philosophy, which is kind of comes from critical theory and critical practice. But I think that it's going to be responsive to the subject matter, but there's going to be like a feedback mechanism between those two things, I would have thought.
So we're running out of time a little bit. So
sorry,
no, it's fine.
Been talking a long
We've
time.
got 3 listeners' questions.
Okay.
So the first one is from Alec, who asks, "Can studying philosophy actually help you in your own life to any tangible effect?"
Yeah, it can make you really unhappy.
First-hand experience.
No, I mean, I wouldn't do it if. I'm going to say, I'm going to speak for myself here. Yes. And I wouldn't do it if it didn't. And this goes back to what I wanted to say earlier about the existential side of things. Even if we don't have this somewhat romantic conception of philosophy as a study of meaning of life, and we're going to get some grand answer about that. I do it because I find the world strikes me as compelling and in need of understanding in particular ways, and certainly philosophy has helped me to make sense of the world. It's also made it extremely confusing, and it can be stressful. Because the other thing that I can't speak for people in other subjects, but certainly in philosophy, philosophy doesn't go away. I think that it's a form of living as well. And once you start on a philosophical path, unless you kind of become quietistic and you just think philosophy can't answer these sorts of questions, or it can't help us, it's kind of it becomes a way in which you kind of engage with the world in total. But I mean, I can't say that I've sorted things out, but I have, through doing philosophy, I have a way that I think about the world, and that is definitely as a result of my philosophical studies. There's ways that I want to think, and not just about abstract kind of questions about the nature of objects, like what I think a human is, what I think the relationship between humans are, what I think, how I understand gender, for example. These are as a result of my studies.
So a related question to this is from Thomas. He says a lot of the episodes that we've done on the podcast are quite beyond his depth, which is unfortunate, but he says, do we actually need philosophy, and do we gain anything from it as just a regular person? Do you think that they need philosophy in their lives?
Well, as I said, I think that they have philosophy in their lives.
Whether they like it or not.
Kind of like, yeah. But that's not, I mean, that is a good question, and it's a relevant question. I suppose the more substantial, the substantial way to think about that is that does the person that doesn't do philosophy that isn't themselves a capital P philosopher, do they need people out there who are, and do they benefit from that? I personally think that they do. I mean, whether this is a good thing or not, the answer is that that philosophy does impact on people. I think that the Enlightenment period, it's kind of like mid 17th, late to late 18th century. That was the philosophers shaped the Enlightenment, and for better or worse, we still are feeling the effects of the Enlightenment and the way in which we think about the world, and this is kind of in kind of a very Western sense. I mean, so I should have actually said that. Actually, all of what I'm saying is parochial. I mean, not only is it my opinion, a lot of it has just been my opinion, but also I'm talking about a very particular tradition of inquiry. I'm talking about a largely Western-centric, to use a term, which is problematic in itself. But and I certainly wouldn't want to make any claims beyond that. But and these kind of, the Enlightenment, the effects of that is still felt in the arts. It's still felt, in a kind of diffuse way that it might not be immediately obvious the impact that philosophy has had, but I think that it has had an impact.
Absolutely. Okay, final question is from Rachel, who asks, do you think that philosophy could be better used as a tool in the education of young people? So in primary schools, for example, would it be beneficial to teach the philosophical method?
Well, my understanding is that there's been studies done on this, so there's definitely going to be just a straightforward empirical kind of dimension to this. And I don't know. My understanding, but I could be completely wrong, is that where some philosophical programs have been taught to younger children, there's been kind of some sort of quantifiable success. But that's, that would, we need to actually look at the studies. So I'd be reticent to make any claim off the back of that. My inclination is to say, one thing that I think that philosophy, when it's at least the sorts of philosophy that we've kind of been focusing on here, one way that it can be very beneficial is when it's practiced right. It's a collegial activity, in the sense that it's a shared activity where we together try and understand the world around us. And why I think that's important is that just starting from that position, what we're doing is we ought to then be interested in what other people think. We ought to be respectful of what other people think, hear them out, be charitable. And when we're involved in offering criticism, that criticism and that analysis is there's a fairness that comes with that, and that and an attentiveness in dialogue and in an intellectual exchange. Do I think that philosophers even always manage that? Certainly not. That's quite idealistic in one sense, but I think that that's something that philosophers should aim towards, and as kind of like an intellectual come ethical activity, I think that's something that would be good for anybody to experience and to understand as a kind of a structure for how they're going to kind of inquire into the world and inquire into the world with other people, rather than as kind of like intellectual like kung fu or something like that, trying to kill your opponent, which some philosophers themselves characterize philosophy as. I personally don't.
Perfect. Richard, you've been amazing. Thank you very much.